Under the soft haze of a late summer morning, a group of corporate employees filed off a charter bus into the crisp air of a secluded retreat center nestled deep within the woods of Vermont. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance, birds chirped over the hum of distant conversation. It was the annual team-building retreat for Everbright Systems, a mid-sized but ambitious tech company that prided itself on its culture. Collaborative, innovative, forward-thinking. At least that was the brochure version. In reality, these retreats had become more of a stage for middle management to perform leadership, for extroverted staff to compete in games that barely concealed their hunger for recognition, and for quieter employees to quietly disappear into the background. Among the crowd that morning, one woman moved without drawing much attention. Grace Taylor? At 27, she had the kind of quiet beauty that didn't announce itself. High cheekbones partially hidden under a loose strand of hair, eyes that seemed to notice everything but reveal very little, and a figure neither dressed up nor neglected. She wore a light gray hoodie, faded jeans, and hiking sneakers that had clearly seen more real trails than trendy sidewalks. No name tag, no company sweatshirt, no overeager smile. She looked like someone who might be helping to coordinate the event, maybe part of the catering or logistics team. And so everyone treated her as such. Polite but dismissive, friendly but distant. When the staff began forming into teams for the day's opening exercises, no one called out her name. No one asked if she'd been assigned a group. Grace stood off to the side near a wooden bench, hands in her pockets, as people paired up and ran through icebreakers, shared stories of their pets, and made jokes about who would win the Trust Fall Championship. A few glanced her way and then looked past her, assuming someone else would handle her. She didn't interrupt, didn't volunteer, didn't correct anyone's assumptions. She simply smiled softly when spoken to, and nodded when someone vaguely gestured that more coffee would be great. The retreat's lead organizer, a bubbly HR executive named Allison, passed right by Grace with a clipboard in hand, offering a chipper. "Good morning." Without recognizing the woman's name or face, Grace returned the greeting calmly without any trace of offense. It wasn't the first time people had assumed she was someone else, someone lower, someone less. And by now, she knew better than to correct them. After the initial rounds of icebreakers and coffee-fueled games, the group was herded toward a large clearing bordered by tall trees where the first major exercise of the day would take place. A makeshift stage had been set up, just a few wooden crates pushed together, with colorful ropes and props scattered nearby. Allison, now wearing a branded Everbright fleece and a headset microphone as if hosting a daytime talk show, bounced onto the center crate and clapped her hands enthusiastically. "Okay, everyone, it's time for our first challenge. Survival scenario," she announced, her voice carrying across the clearing. "This is all about leadership, trust, and creative problem solving. Your teams are going to simulate surviving a disaster together, but each group must first choose one member to be sacrificed. A fun little twist." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "That person will be removed from the challenge and given a separate role. Tied up, held hostage, something creative. Don't worry, it's all metaphorical." "Sort of." She winked, clearly thrilled with herself. Grace stood in the back, still unassigned to any team, holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. She watched the others with a mix of quiet amusement and detachment. They were good people mostly, just a bit too eager to impress each other. As the groups began selecting their sacrifice, a few voices rose above the buzz. "We nominate Jared. He's too competitive anyway. Come on, let's tie up Linda. She's always telling us what to do." Everyone laughed. The ritual humiliation had become a team-building trope. That was when someone from Team Blue turned and pointed vaguely toward the edge of the group, to where Grace stood. "Hey, what about her?" a man's voice called out. It was Brian, one of the junior project managers, always eager to earn points with leadership through participation. "She's not on any team, right?" Others looked over. There was a beat of silence. "She's not even wearing a name tag," someone else added. "She probably works here," another said with a shrug. Allison furrowed her brow and jogged over with her clipboard, scanning her list. "Grace, right? Sorry, I don't see your name anywhere. Were you added last minute?" Grace tilted her head slightly. "I RSVP'd. Allison replied with a breezy smile that barely disguised her dismissiveness. Well, we're a little tight on team slots anyway. Do you mind being part of the scenario instead? It's not a big deal, just for the fun of the exercise. The words hung in the air like a benign request, but Grace understood their undertone. She glanced at the ropes piled near the crates and then at the crowd, who were already looking away, returning to their groups, satisfied that the matter had been resolved. Grace could have said no. She could have pointed out how inappropriate it was, how it crossed a line, how unprofessional it all was. But instead, she gave a soft nod. Sure, I don't mind. And that was that. Moments later, she was standing against the wide trunk of a sugar maple tree at the edge of the clearing. Two overly enthusiastic participants from Team Blue loosely tied her hands to the bark using thick nylon rope, giggling as they did it. Don't worry, not too tight, one said, like it was all some kind of joke at summer camp. You're our symbolic liability, or whatever Allison said. It's basically an honor. Someone snapped a group photo with her in the background, already half out of frame. Within minutes, the rest of the group had moved on to act out their survival challenges. Building fake fires, solving puzzles about food rations, blindfolding one another, and pretending to cross rivers. Grace stood alone, in partial shade, tethered gently to the tree like a forgotten coat hung on a hook. She could hear snippets of dialogue and laughter from the teams, the distant zip of a frisbee, the booming encouragements from Allison's mic as she strutted between groups offering tips like a motivational guru. No one checked on Grace. No one returned. They weren't cruel, not consciously. They just stopped thinking about her. To them, she had become part of the scenery, a placeholder, a passive object in a simulation designed to reinforce the idea that everyone had value, while ironically reinforcing who did and who didn't. A breeze picked up, ruffling the leaves above her. Grace turned her face slightly toward the sound and closed her eyes. She wasn't uncomfortable, not physically, but the moment had crystallized something. There was a quiet shift in the air, one she felt deep in her chest, like a piano key struck in a still room, resonating softly. And in that space of quiet, she realized something that made her lips curve, almost imperceptibly into a small, knowing smile. The sunlight had shifted by the time the survival games ended, casting long, slanting shadows across the grass as the afternoon deepened. The air had grown heavier, the scent of pine now mixed with distant smoke from a makeshift campfire someone had lit for the wilderness atmosphere. The participants, red-cheeked and loud from mock trials and leadership tasks, gathered again in the central field. There was laughter, more of that sharp kind, born not from joy but from the friction of performance, of people who wanted to be seen contributing, excelling, belonging. Someone made a joke about which team would definitely survive a bear attack, and someone else quipped about trading interns for trail mix. Beneath it all pulsed the unmistakable energy of relief. Relief that the hard part of the day was over, that no one had failed in public, that they'd played along well enough to be remembered when bonuses were handed out in December, and still no one had checked on Grace. She had remained where they left her, near the sugar maple tree, wrists loosely bound, posture upright and calm. The rope hadn't been tight, and she could have slipped out of it at any moment, but she hadn't. That wasn't the point. The point was how long it would take for someone to notice. How long it would take for the illusion of inclusion to break under its own weight. Eventually, she freed herself with quiet movements, slipping the rope down past her wrists and letting it fall gently to the forest floor. She brushed the bark dust from her sleeves and stepped out into the open, not in protest but in observation. She walked back to the clearing slowly, taking in the dynamics unfolding like a stage play before her. No one gasped. No one looked surprised to see her walking free. In fact, a few people glanced at her, squinting slightly as if trying to place her face. One man raised his eyebrows, clearly unsure whether she had been there earlier or was arriving now for the first time. Grace made her way to the refreshments table and poured herself a cup of water. She stood a few paces away from the others beneath a wide sycamore tree that offered flickering light between its branches. From this position, she could hear the scattered conversations, most of them work-related, some performative, the kind that disguised competition beneath corporate speak. They talked about quarterly targets, office politics, who was clearly angling for a promotion, and how one guy from engineering had completely botched his role in the food allocation challenge. No one mentioned the girl who had stood tied to a tree for nearly 2 hours. No one asked. Eventually, a young man approached her. His name was Tyler, one of the newer hires for marketing. Eager, socially uncertain, and constantly second-guessing himself. He offered a lopsided smile as he sipped a sports drink. "Hey, were you, actually part of the activity?" he asked. "Or were you just observing or something?" Grace looked at him for a moment before replying. "I was the sacrifice," she said, without emotion or irony. Tyler chuckled awkwardly, unsure if she was joking. "Oh, right," he said, nodding. "Cool. Well, good job, I guess." Then he walked off to rejoin his group, where someone was already distributing marshmallows. Grace didn't watch him go. Instead, she looked out over the field and noted how easily people forgot what made them uncomfortable. No one had meant to hurt her. That was what made it worse. This hadn't been bullying in the traditional sense. It was something more mundane, something colder, a collective neglect that wore the mask of team spirit. She wasn't hated, she was irrelevant. Soon after, Allison called out for the next activity, the Leadership Labyrinth. Teams would select one person to be blindfolded and led through a complex rope maze using only verbal commands from their teammates. More cheers, more excitement, more exaggerated competitiveness. Grace wasn't called, again. But this time, someone noticed. Rachel, senior HR, late 30s, kind but shallow, approached her with a nervous, practiced smile while chewing on a granola bar. "Hey," she said, brushing crumbs from her ever-bright hoodie. "So sorry, I think we might have missed putting you in a team. Happens every year with one or two folks. Total glitch. Were you assigned to Blue?" Grace smiled faintly. No team." Rachel gave a sympathetic tilt of the head, the kind often reserved for toddlers who've dropped their ice cream. "Oh, no. Well, hey, no worries. There's a reflection session after dinner, so you'll still be part of the debrief. It's really where the magic happens, if I'm honest." Then she was gone. Grace stood a while longer under the tree, hands wrapped around the paper cup. The air was shifting again, cooler now as clouds began to gather behind the tree line. The evening would come soon, and so would the truth. She was no longer interested in waiting for someone to notice her. It was only a matter of time before they realized what they'd been blind to all day, and she wouldn't need to say a single dramatic word to make that happen. By the time the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting a burnt orange glow across the retreat grounds, the energy of the group had shifted. The adrenaline from the earlier games had worn off, replaced by a kind of sluggish camaraderie. People leaning back on benches, laughing more softly now, their voices lower, a little hoarse from shouting directions during the rope maze challenge. Paper cups were being refilled with lemonade and boxed wine, snacks were picked over, and shoes had been kicked off by the fire pit. The crowd had melted into loose circles, where conversation turned more personal, more reflective, as it often did during these late afternoon lulls. Grace sat a little apart from them, at the edge of the clearing near a low stone wall, watching everything with a stillness that seemed almost meditative. She had taken off her hoodie and tied it around her waist, revealing a pale blue t-shirt with no logo, no branding, nothing that gave away who she was or why she was here. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a subtle tension in the way her hands clasped around a ceramic mug someone had finally offered her. It was peppermint tea, still too hot to drink. From where she sat, she could hear bits and pieces of conversations drifting toward her like smoke. Talk about kids, dogs, flights missed, bad managers, good managers, that one guy from tech who always took credit for others' work. Names were exchanged, complaints shared, occasional laughs interrupted by long, thoughtful silences. A few glanced her way, mostly out of curiosity. One woman whispered something to another, a question followed by a shrug, the universal code for no idea who she is. No one asked her to join. No one remembered that she had been left out of every group. No one remembered the tree. And Grace, to her own surprise, didn't feel pain about that, not anymore. There was a moment earlier in the day, standing alone, still tied, watching the others play as if she were invisible when she'd felt a familiar flicker of hurt. But that had passed. What remained now was a clear, grounded calm, like standing in still water after the ripple has faded. A part of her had known from the start that today would go this way. That's why she had come. Somewhere near the main cabin, Allison tapped her mic again and asked for everyone to gather by the fire pit for a very special evening moment. The kind of phrase that promised something performative but harmless. People shuffled toward the logs and folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, some groaning dramatically about the bugs, others finishing their drinks before settling in. Grace moved with them this time, not to participate but to observe. She took a place slightly behind the circle where the fire's glow just touched her feet, but didn't light her face. Allison stood at the center holding a stack of cards and beamed. "This," she said with deep conviction, "is the soul of the retreat. We've played, we've struggled, we've overcome fake disasters." Soft laughter. "But now we talk about what we've learned, what we've seen in each other, where we've grown." She shuffled the cards, each one containing a reflection prompt. "I'll read a few and then anyone can share. Totally voluntary. But I promise, it's where the real bonding begins." The first few prompts were innocuous. Name someone who surprised you today. What did you learn about trust? When did you feel vulnerable? Predictably, the first volunteers were from the usual group, the same handful who had dominated the earlier activities, who felt comfortable speaking, who knew their words would land well. Several talked about being blindfolded in the maze, about learning to delegate, about not being afraid to ask for help. Someone cried, genuinely it seemed, about letting go of control. The fire flickered warmly as heads nodded and affirmations were murmured. Grace remained silent. The moment was almost too perfect in its symmetry. No one mentioned her, but more than once a voice would falter mid-thought when someone caught sight of her, standing there in the shadows, just long enough to wonder. And that was when she knew. The absence had been noticed. Too late to apologize for, but too early to fully understand. It hovered in the air like a skipped beat in a song. No one dared to say, "We tied her to a tree and forgot." But the knowledge of it was there, unspoken and slowly dawning. A quiet discomfort began to replace the earlier glow of achievement. And Grace could feel it land in their bones, subtle and irreversible. For the first time all day, she took a step forward. Not toward the fire, not into the circle, but just enough that the light now caught her face. The group didn't gasp or whisper. They simply turned, instinctively, like flowers bending toward sudden sunlight. And in that small movement, Grace felt the balance shift. No announcement, no confrontation, just presence. And it was enough. As twilight deepened and the woods fell into a hush, pierced only by the occasional crack of the fire and the soft clink of mugs being set down, something subtle but unmistakable shifted in the group's atmosphere. The storytelling circle had unraveled into smaller conversations, laughter becoming rare, replaced by murmurs and glances. It wasn't because anyone had said anything wrong or because an argument had broken out. It was because the silence around Grace had become too loud to ignore. People who had spent the entire day treating her as if she weren't quite there now found themselves occasionally looking her way, trying to remember how she'd arrived or if she had ever actually introduced herself. A few, out of politeness or guilt, offered her small nods or tight smiles that didn't quite land. The problem wasn't what had been done, it was what hadn't. The tree, the rope, the way she hadn't been part of anything, and how easily everyone had gone along with that, never questioning why. And yet Grace remained calm, unbothered, her presence neither accusing nor theatrical. That was what made it worse. If she had lashed out, demanded apologies, called attention to the oversight, they might have written her off as dramatic or hypersensitive. But she didn't. She simply existed with a steadiness that made every moment of past neglect feel heavier, more undeniable. She had become a mirror, and no one liked what they saw. Allison, sensing a vague discomfort spreading among the group, but unable to pinpoint its source, tried to redirect the energy. With her ever-present clipboard now resting on her knee, she stood again by the fire and clapped her hands together. "Okay, team," she said with forced enthusiasm. "We've got one more special treat before dinner. A guest is joining us. Someone who's been instrumental in shaping our company's journey, even if they've stayed behind the scenes lately." She looked around, proud of the vague drama she had orchestrated, like a magician about to reveal the final trick. Let's give a warm welcome to someone very important to Everbright Systems, our CEO, David Lang. Gasps and surprised chatter rippled through the circle. The idea that David Lang, the famously elusive and media-shy executive who rarely made public appearances, was suddenly here, at their retreat among the fire pits and sleeping bags sent an electric jolt through the group. People sat up straighter, smoothed their clothes, whispered excitedly. A few stood, scanning the darkened path that led to the parking lot, and sure enough, footsteps approached. Measured, confident, unhurried. David emerged from the darkness without spectacle. He wore a simple dark jacket, jeans, and a pair of hiking boots dusty from the trail. He didn't smile broadly or raise his hands in greeting. He just nodded as if he'd been there the whole time and was simply returning to the fire after a long walk. People clapped, hesitantly at first, then louder. Allison beamed, already imagining the LinkedIn post she would write. "Thank you for coming, David," she gushed, moving to offer him the central seat. But he didn't take it. Instead, his eyes scanned the group slowly, deliberately. He wasn't just greeting, he was looking, measuring. When his gaze landed on Grace, something shifted in his posture. He didn't flinch or widen his eyes, he simply stepped toward her, with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had made up his mind long ago. A few people turned their heads to follow him, confused. Then he spoke, his voice calm and low, but cutting through the air like a bell. "You all remember Grace Taylor, don't you?" The silence that followed was almost physical. It had weight. People looked at one another, searching for clues. A few murmured uncertainly. Someone whispered, "Wait, Grace?" But no one answered. David continued, his voice steady. "I suppose not. That's not surprising. I've watched from a distance today, and I noticed the same thing she probably did. It's remarkable how a group of people, all supposedly focused on inclusion and collaboration, can so effortlessly overlook someone standing right in front of them. A ripple passed through the group like a dropped pebble in a still lake. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared at Grace as if seeing her for the first time. "Let me make this simple," David said. "Grace isn't a visitor. She's not an assistant or a facilitator. She's not here to bring water or tie ropes or fill out name tags. She's the co-founder of Everbright Systems. My partner, my equal. The one who wrote the framework we still use. The one who built the internal architecture you rely on every day while you're busy optimizing slide decks." Now it landed. Someone audibly inhaled. A woman's hand flew to her mouth. A man dropped his paper plate. But Grace didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. David turned toward her briefly, then back to the group. She stepped back from the company 2 years ago. Not because she wasn't capable, but because she believed in building something quietly, sustainably, without the noise. She believed in hiring people who would treat each other with respect, even when there weren't cameras or CEOs in the room. I asked her to join us today, not to spy or test anyone, but because I thought maybe the culture we dreamed of still existed. I was wrong. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was devastating, because every person sitting around that fire could remember some moment earlier that day. Some gesture, some comment, some opportunity they had to see her, speak to her, include her, and hadn't. And it was too late to undo that. David looked once more at Grace, then nodded to the group. "I'll leave you now. I think you've got plenty to reflect on." He turned and walked back into the trees. And Grace? She remained still for a moment longer. Then slowly she stepped into the light of the fire, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago made peace with being underestimated. And now, for the first time, no one looked past her. The fire had burned lower now, the once bright flames reduced to glowing coals that pulsed softly in the dimming light. No one moved. The group sat frozen, as if motion might somehow rewind time, as if staying still could erase what had just unfolded. The revelation hung in the air, thick and unrelenting, a quiet judgment that needed no further explanation. Grace stood alone at the edge of the firelight, no longer hidden, no longer misidentified, no longer ignored. The same people who had spoken over her, around her, or not at all now, sat mute, their faces betraying a kaleidoscope of emotions. Shock, guilt, confusion, and something else more fragile. Shame. Not because she had exposed them, but because she hadn't. She had let the day play out exactly as it was, without interruption, without defense, without any need to assert her position. And in doing so, she'd forced them to see themselves without filter or excuse. No one knew what to say, and for the first time all day, Silence felt like an honest response. Allison was the first to try to recover. She stepped forward, her expression carefully calibrated somewhere between warmth and damage control. "Grace," she began, her voice softer now, stripped of the performative cheerfulness it had worn all day. "I think we all owe you, well—" She faltered, glancing at the circle as if seeking help. "Maybe an apology." Grace looked at her, expression unreadable. "An apology for what?" she asked, not with hostility, but with a stillness that demanded truth. Allison blinked, momentarily thrown off. "For the misunderstanding. For not realizing who you were. For leaving you out." The words came out small, scattered, unsure of their own adequacy. Grace nodded slowly. "But you didn't leave me out because you didn't know who I was. You left me out because of who you assumed I wasn't." A quiet gasp moved through the circle, but no one dared speak. "I didn't come here to be honored or recognized," she continued, voice steady but soft, like a steady drumbeat beneath the wind. "I came here to see who we'd become. I wanted to know if the culture we dreamed of could survive without someone constantly reminding you to see each other." She turned her gaze slowly across the circle, meeting each set of eyes without flinching. "I built this company with David to be a place where the loudest voice didn't always win, where intelligence wasn't measured by wardrobe or title, and today, I stood silently and watched as people who talk about inclusion and empathy walked past someone they didn't recognize, because she didn't look important." She let that land. It did. One man, a senior developer who had spent much of the day joking about his MBA, shifted in his seat, his eyes glassy. A woman from operations pulled her sweater tighter, arms crossed not against the cold, but against the prickling of her own conscience. "You want to build trust," Grace continued, "but you keep confusing trust with performance. You think team building is about games and group photos and catchphrases? It's not. It's about what you do when no one's watching, when there's no spotlight, when the person next to you doesn't demand your attention, but still deserves it." Her voice had not risen once, but it carried more weight than any of the planned speeches or leadership cards ever could. "I don't want a formal apology," she said. "I want you to think about why it took a CEO to make you notice me. And I want you to remember what it felt like. When the firelight shifted, and you realized someone had been standing in the shadows all day, watching, listening, remembering." She paused as if giving them a moment to breathe, to truly hear it. Then she took one step back from the circle and turned, not with drama or finality, but with quiet intention. And as she walked slowly into the darkness between the trees, no one followed. Not because they didn't care, but because they finally understood that this was not her lesson to finish. It was theirs. The next morning, the retreat grounds were quiet in a way they hadn't been the day before. The laughter was softer, the footsteps more measured, and the air, though just as crisp, seemed to carry a different kind of weight. No one spoke of the schedule out loud, though breakfast was served and the activities board remained unchanged. People moved slowly between the lodge and the clearing, their conversations hushed, their glances occasionally drifting toward the path that led into the woods, as if expecting Grace to reappear at any moment. But she didn't. Her absence was not a departure. It was a presence that lingered. Every corner of the retreat now held the imprint of the day before. The tree where she had stood, the place by the fire where she had spoken, the empty chair no one dared to claim. David Lang hadn't returned either. His silence, like hers, seemed to ask a question no one was ready to answer. In the dining hall, Allison moved from table to table with less of her usual energy. The clipboard was gone, the headset tucked away. She no longer narrated the experience. She was, for the first time, listening more than she spoke. At one table, Rachel stared into her coffee, whispering, "I just didn't think. I didn't even look at her." And around her, others nodded. Not to excuse, but to admit. The group had come to bond over artificial challenges, but in the end, the real test had unfolded when no one realized a test was happening. And they had failed. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but in the quiet, everyday way that people fail each other when they choose ease over attention. Grace's presence had revealed more than titles ever could. And now, even in her absence, the lesson endured. By midday, the team had gathered one final time in the main lodge, this time without any planned activity, without games or icebreakers or exercises. Just a circle of people, eyes open in a new way, hearts slightly less armored. And on a whiteboard that had once listed meal times and team names, someone had written in plain black marker 5 simple words. What are we choosing to see? No one signed it, they didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who had taught them to ask.